I had also programmed an hour for Ron to respond, and I think we'll probably have some wiggle room there. So I want to make sure some of that time is open conversation. And then I think the plan going forward, so that the folks that just went get some individual engagement, is that I'll budget about 10 minutes for folks to engage Josh and Bernard, and then we'll move on to the next panel. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
One final thing, and this is just something to do in between panels. I got a card that we can give to Matt. That's back there. That just there's nothing written in it. It's just hopefully like a good gesture. So I would love it if y'all would write in that, and I will give it to Jess at the end of the day, and then she can convey it to Matt. So that's just back there, and I left a pen also. So yeah. Yes, Kristen.
Any way we can take up a little collection?
Yeah. Let's talk about that at dinner. I mean, I think that's something we should definitely, think about. But yeah, if there, I would like to think about ways to be supportive in a more substantive way. And so I will try and give y'all something more concrete soon. Yeah. So let's take about 10 minutes and talk about Josh and Bernard. Y'all have questions, comments, engagements, replies?
So I mentioned it in the elevator, Bernard. I just wanted to clarify. So let's talk about Foxconn, because you were saying that part of your paper needs, like, how do I get this back to the U.S.?
Yeah.
And yet Foxconn is coming, right? Aren't they coming to Wisconsin?
I mean, they're already here in different places in
Okay.
different ways. I mean, clearly, but they're not. I mean, the question about this Wisconsin facility, when they first posed it, was a 50,000. Was for 50,000 workers, and I'm surely they were not going to use this dormitory military discipline model. But and there's other big questions about Foxconn there and why they were there. One of them was because they were doing these certain kinds of flat screen TVs that need like incredible amounts of water to process, so they were looking for places by the Great Lakes. The book that I take this movement back and forth from is by Gene and John Komaroff. It's called Theory from the South, that one. So it's like I'm just kind of grabbing onto their basic idea that it's not just that we don't have a economic development in the old ways of developed and undeveloped countries, but that in fact the model of the first world, what used to be the first world, is actually going to follow more and more, which will be the cutting edge of kind of a radical inequality, radical exploitative politics, a radical exploitative capitalism, which is going to happen in places that are traditionally in the South. And so so on the one hand, the question would be for me, I think if you would like, the most cynical answer is that the first, what we used to call, but I would call it here like a fourth world idea, the idea of like third world zones, what used to be third world zones, like in the United States, that older model, that if they run out of people in China, and it will be a while, right? And for the record, these are not horrible jobs in China. I mean, there's a lot of more stuff happening in the last few years that in the labor unions in Taiwan. In fact, I think about 40 of these young labor kids from Hong Kong were taken into custody and have not been heard from for the last couple of weeks. Happened about a month ago. That these jobs traditionally were okay, right? These were people who came in from the country and they would go home and they were producing pretty good. People are saying that, you know, people work in these factories for 4 or 5 years and they come out with nothing. Like they can't save any money even if they're working in the dorms. The question for me would be, is it the cynical idea, I guess, is that there are going to be places even in Wisconsin or that you have such an economic inequality of zones where you might have the opportunity to kind of bring this kind of now hybrid models of industrial production back with the idea that, you know, that's the direction we're going. Right, there's more people.
So can I just jump in to follow up on that? So I've been thinking, since we talked about before lunch. So the thing in Wisconsin, why it was a good idea, is that there are probably hundreds of thousands of unemployed people in Milwaukee.
Exactly what I was saying. That's what I mean.
But with the cultural difference that actually asking people to show up at a certain time of day and do tasks that they're assigned sober and straight and perform well, that was an unreasonable expectation.
In Wisconsin.
For cultural and historical, I mean, terrible reasons.
Yes.
But how do you incorporate those issues of the differences in the cultural history and people's attitudes towards labor and all of those kinds of things into your analysis? Because I think that's really what fell apart in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm thinking about was not necessarily the fact that there might be some kind of new modes of super exploitative that there's enough poor people here, there's enough opioid addicted communities, there's enough poverty that we won't see a kind of base exploitative production manufacturing come back to the States. For me, what's more interesting is to think about the way that the form of taking people and putting them together in mass and then having it produce something like what capital used to have to invest heavily in, whether that be in a production line or trucks to distribute Amazon products, for instance. So for me, it's like where is there a functional way? It's going to come back. I mean, if it comes to the United States, I think it has to come in a different form, right? It's not just going to come in the same form. But in this case, it so clearly, right, this app-based work so clearly demands something other than just selling your time to a capitalist in exchange for a labor, that when you have to bring your own instruments or when you have to bring your own machines, it's like an anachronistic mode that's also the future, right? So it's like piecework that's also the new form of work. And what I think makes it happen is this massive quantity to quality transformation that happens when you put 100,000 people in a factory together. When you put in the U.S., 1 million people distributed into all these cities operating through this. And let's not forget the irony of the phone that's being produced by Foxconn there is like, if you want to go back to the zombies, like it's a contagion, right? There's some kind of viral, it has to come back some way. And the materiality of it is this, right? It's the actual thing that was made already in this formula, and then it comes back, and Marx, I think, would be cool with the idea that like the commodity form, in this case the specific social historical commodity form, would have other cultural, social, and organizational effects, right?
Would you include Mechanical Turk people
Yeah.
What's that?
in the category that you're talking about?
What kind of people?
Mechanical Turk, people who are earning their living through Mechanical Turk.
I would. So can you explain?
I don't know. Yeah, explain it, because I'm just not
So
quite getting it.
it's different size tasks, but I know graduate students here at AI.
Oh yeah. I think that as long as you're working with some sort of like, if what puts you together is an algorithmic app, and then you bring your, I mean, this was like the gig economy is, I think these different, have different models. The one that struck me structurally was the like bring your own car, like bring your asset and your time. That seems structurally different. But if you're like just picking up a job to go work at somebody's house, I mean, what we could then go back into is what kind of labor is this become?
But Mechanical Turk, you're bringing your laptop, your computer.
A mechanical Turk, so it's like doing laptop, doing.
It's work that presumably computers should be doing, but computers cannot do, like the production.
Okay, yes.
Actually, what you
I'll
were
have to
talking
look it up.
Tech
So
surveys,
they
proofreading
hire
things.
people,
Yes.
like graduate students, with like research
Okay,
in the
thank you.
humanities. It's done by
Never heard
humans.
of that.
It's done by humans, and it's the kind of stuff you would expect to have been done by some sort of structural thing. They would have machined it,
Yeah.
and they may like, constantly they're trying to like write AI programs to do this stuff,
Yeah.
but there's always this kind of never this unfolding.
That's very interesting regarding
Yes.
women's labor. It's
Yes,
labor
this is the
that
one- that's what I
cannot
was
be
gonna say.
mechanized.
It comes back, and it will be, a lot of these like gig economy is all that kind of, which was domestic or home
Right.
labor being, it's a new, even more efficient way to distribute these. What you're already doing kind of thing. You're already driving around, go. You're already cleaning the house, just do someone else's today.
Right.
And you'll get a little bit of money.
Do mine.
So Bernard's comment reminds me, his reference to the commodity form. So regarding your first, what do you call it, weakness of your argument, or do you remember you said?
The limitation.
The limitations, that's
Yeah.
right. So regarding the first one, namely whether Marx addresses, is he a dualist when it comes to rhetoric as opposed to materiality?
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't his commodity fetishism theory totally undermine such a dualism?
Yeah.
When
I
he
mean, I
says
think it
that-
does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
abstract
I'm just
thought
saying
is
that-
determined by materiality.
Yeah.
So,
I just think in the discipline, a
Yeah.
lot of people read him as sort of as
It's bad
rhetoric
reading.
being super structural and
It's bad
operating.
reading.
It's bad reading.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a limitation, and more of a requirement. Like you have to correct something in the discipline. That's not a flaw in your argument. It's a
Right,
flaw
right.
in the reception, and you have to like respond to it in a way that
Yeah.
changes that.
Right.
I mean, I do think there's still some potentially anthropocentric dimensions of Marx's project that I'm kind of like thinking through right now, you know?
He himself was not conscious of what he was arguing. I agree. I mean, nobody, no big philosopher was conscious of what they were saying, right? That's why we're still reading them.
But I mean, insofar as commodities come from the material world and they're products of materiality, you know, it does undermine that distinction, yeah.
Well, and also, like, to get to the last point of what you were saying, the, like, anthropocentric part, I mean, I think you could put him in the same category as, like, Sylvia Wynter or some of these folks who are kind of being brought up to mediate the debates about humanism, where, like, if you consider the humanist something that's historically produced, you're not he's not a post-humanist, but he's also not, traditionally speaking, a humanist, right?
Yeah, like I find Althusser's reading of him pretty persuasive.
Okay.
Can I ask Josh a quick question? So what part of what I'm trying to also figure out though is how you can how did you put it? How can you deal with matter's ontological rhetoricity without requiring a globalization thesis?
Without requiring?
Yeah, right. Don't you need both? I mean, you say you want to push back against the world as rhetoric. I mean, what the globalization thesis means for rhetoric is a general sort of recognition of how the world is either symbolized through some processes of symbols in societies, or for those not in our God, right? Or it means basically the world can be read as a text, therefore, right?
But so
rhetoric is everywhere. Right?
So I would say for me, like the key difference is that, like I mentioned it multiple times, that I view matter as asymmetrical.
Sure.
So there's an asymmetry in the way matter constitutes itself and the way like social systems build off of matter. So I think like the big rhetoric hypothesis, like sort of, it does like a flat ontology thing. It just projects symbolicity onto everything, right? And I think that with the asymmetrical perspective, there's still like material social configurations, such as the things that Marx grapple with, that are important. But everything is asymmetrical with everything else, so there's no equality among everything. So that would be how I would try to approach it.
All right, thanks. I think what we'll do, so we have 2 more panels and then open time for a response. So we can take questions on each panel. I think after that we can just move into general discussion, and that can go for a while, and I'll make sure Ron gets some room to respond. But we can spend maybe a little bit more breathing room at the other end. So with that, I would like to introduce the next panel, entitled Expressing / Constructing Surplus, Anti-Capitalist Epistemologies, forgive my parentheses, and linguistic tricks. I kind of programmed this to follow the transition from these really grounded arguments about race, gender, ecology, and Marx, and the kind of ontological perspective that Josh, and to some extent both of the last 2 papers are picking up. The first paper is presented by Karina Cordella at Macalester College and is entitled Affect and Time in Marx. And the second paper is presented by Catherine Chaput, say that right? Cool. At the University of Nevada, Reno, entitled Marx and the Rhetorical Ontologies of Anti-Capitalist Subject Matter.
Anybody who didn't receive the handout, my handout?
She charges those.
Oh. Yeah. And don't apply the condo approach to this. Don't throw it away. It doesn't make you happy. So yes, Mark just mentioned, thank you very much for inviting me, by the way. And thank you all for being here. And Mark mentioned the title of my talk, which was initially Time and Affecting Marx. Okay. So I will give you the numbers of the citations as we go along. So Marx's Affect is the title, the actual. Oh, I need to take. How do I do this?
I think it's on. It looks like it's on.
Yeah. Okay. So Marx's Affect, and my paper is divided in 2 sections, and the first section is called Labor Power or Transindividual Affective Power. Marx writes that, number 1, labor capacity is the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities of a human being which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind. There will be he throughout all Marx citations. We all know about that. So he, meaning Marx, stresses the fact that, number 2, labor power is the use value which the worker has to offer to others in general, that is not materialized in a product, does not exist apart from him at all, thus exists not really but only in potentiality. Labor power is the body's and mind's power to actualize their potentialities, that is, whatever they possibly could. And the act of laboring is the process in which labor, as a pure capability, power, or potentiality, actualizes itself in actual effects. In short, labor power is the power of self-actualization. Those familiar with Spinoza can easily discern the affinity between Marx's conception of labor power and Spinoza's substance. In Spinoza's words, number 3, there is only one substance, so that a substance cannot be produced by anything else and is therefore the cause of itself, causa sui, or, number 4, the power of making itself actual, that's Beth Lord, or, in Deleuze's words, the full unvarying power or potentiality of self-actualization. This power of self-actualization is not the prerogative of some supernatural entity, but is rather what Spinoza calls the singular essence of every individual, human or not. In Gilles Deleuze's words, number 5, singular essence means that any individual is first of all a degree of power, of acting or affecting other individuals, and a certain capacity of being affected by other individuals. In other words, in Spinoza's ontology, individuals or singular essences are degrees of the potential of affecting and being affected in a process in which individuals are being produced. Since it is the interplay between the affective capacities of all individuals that constitutes each of these individuals in the first place, an individual is, in Etienne Balibar's words, trans-individual. It follows that if the analogy between Spinoza's singular essence as affective power and Marx's labor power holds, then labor power must produce not just what we usually call products, but every individual, human or not. Indeed, this follows from Marx's own conception of labor power in general as man's essential powers. This is a term that he uses in his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, man's essential powers, a concept that relates to Marx's critique of Feuerbach's abstract materialism, for which the object is only an object of contemplation, ignoring practical human sensuous activity. Citation from the thesis on Feuerbach. It is through these essential powers that all individuals, humans or not, constitute themselves and each other. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx exemplifies his concept of essential powers through the 5 senses, also as we will see. By senses, he doesn't mean what we normally call the 5 senses. So, for instance, only music awakens, this is Marx's citation, only music awakens in man the sense of music, and even the most beautiful music has no sense for the unmusical ear. Therefore, it is no object for it. At any socio-historical context, the world consists only of objects whose essential power, in this case musicality, is accessible to the essential powers of the human individuals of that socio-historical configuration, in this case the musical ear. For this reason, this is again Marx, for this reason the senses of the social man differ from those of the non-social man. And, number 6, not only the 5 senses, but also the so-called mental senses, the practical senses, will, love, etc. In a word, human sense, the human nature of the senses comes to be by virtue of its object, by virtue of humanized nature. The objective world, Marx continues, becomes everywhere for man in society the world of man's essential powers, human reality, and for that reason the reality of his own essential powers. All objects become for him the objectification of himself, become objects which confirm and realize his individuality, become his objects. That is, man himself becomes the object. The manner in which they become his depends on the nature of the object and on the nature of the essential power corresponding to it. To the eye, an object comes to be other than it is to the ear, and the object of the eye is another object than the object of the ear. The specific character of its essential power is precisely its specific essence, and therefore also the specific mode of its objectification, of its objectively actual living being. Thus, man is affirmed in the objective world, not only in the act of thinking, but with all his senses. That is not just what we usually have in mind under the term five senses, but with all possible human experience of anything in the objective world. The world is constituted through the mutual affective determinations of the essential powers of human and non-human individuals. Accordingly, when, number 7, producing their means of subsistence, so when they're producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their material life. That is, this mode of production must not be considered simply as being the reproduction of the physical existence of the individuals, as if they were pre-given. Rather, it is a definite form of activity. This is the continuation of the passage. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. What they, the individuals, are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and how they produce it. Here we encounter the core of a historical materialist explanation of subjectivity and objectivity, that is a thoroughly trans-individual constitution of humans and objects of nature. The objects of the world are objectifications of their producers, just as the producers are subjectifications of the objective world. Or, in Marx's words, number 8, only through the objectively unfolded richness of man's essential being is the richness of subjective human sensibility, senses affirming themselves as essential powers of man, either cultivated or brought into being. Balibar's account of transindividuality assists further in clarifying Marx's point. That's number 9. Every individual, including human individuals, is an effect of or a moment in a more general and more flexible process of individuation. Since they are not given, individuals are constructed or produced. And since they are not perfect in a final sense, they are active or productive. In this trans-individual process, there is not only an adaptive reciprocity of the individual and its environment, or the interior and the exterior, but rather a reciprocity of interconnected or interdependent processes of individuation. In other words, the processes which lead to separated singularities are not themselves separated. As Balibar concludes, precisely because the result are individuals which tend to indefinitely increase their degree of autonomy, the very idea of isolated processes of individuation is properly unthinkable, which is why both Spinoza and Marx are incompatible with individualism. It is this transindividual or communal affective constitution of every individual being that undergirds Marx's conception of communism as something other than a reductionist economic model. Marx's own work offers ample evidence against economic reductionism,
as it clearly indicates that the economic appropriation and exploitation of labor in terms of surplus value is inseparable from an affective appropriation and exploitation of labor, that is, the exploitation of labor's transindividual positive constitution of life, which evidently relates to the issue of women's labor and all that. So as Marx writes, number 10, all the progress of civilization, or in other words, every increase in the powers of social production, in the productive powers of labor itself, such as results from science, inventions, division and combination of labor, improved means of communication, creation of the world market, machinery, etc., all this enriches not the worker but rather capital. So the productive powers of labor itself that enrich not the worker but rather capital create not just surplus value but also the progress of civilization. That is, the aforementioned body of knowledge and practices that is part of the transindividual positive affective constitution of individuals. Therefore, the transindividual self-actualization cannot be reduced to surplus value, even as surplus value owes its existence to it. Surplus value owes its existence to these productive powers of labor only because capital appropriates them, so that, that's Marx, the creative power of the laborer's labor establishes itself as the power of capital, as an alien power confronting him. By appropriating the transindividual positive affective constitution of individuals, capital sustains and amplifies both the accumulation of surplus value and the production of individuals whose essential powers correspond to surplus value. Okay, so, and this economico-affective exploitation reaches its apogee in today's informatized capitalism, and this is now my second section, called Affective Exploitation in the Informatized Era. By today's informatized era, I refer to the mode of capitalist production in which all production, from agriculture to industrial production, transportation, communication, and all services, and the means of subsistence, which includes leisure, are mediated through information. Okay, so it's not only the modes of production, it's also the means of subsistence, leisure and all that, that are mediated through information. Which is, Brenard made the point, when we export, we don't export an old-fashioned style of production, it's a new style of production because even agriculture is run through computers, okay. So, today's informatized capitalism obtains unforeseen high levels of economic exploitation as well as of conformism because it is the first era that has succeeded in maximizing its affective exploitation due to the colonization of the means of subsistence, including leisure, by the means of production, let's say by information. Put simply, maximum economico-affective exploitation succeeds because we play with the same materials during our so-called leisure time that we use during our so-called labor time. To explain, we must turn to Marx's concept of surplus labor, which is basically it's the umbrella term for everything, including women's labor. That's surplus labor, unpaid labor. Okay. So number 11, if the worker needs only half a working day in order to live a whole day, then in order to keep alive as a worker, he needs to work only half a day. The second half of the labor day is forced labor, surplus labor. In the case of the women, that's a whole day. A labor that drastically contributes to the accumulation of surplus value because it is unpaid labor. What, number 12, appears as surplus value on capital's side appears identically on the worker's side as surplus labor in excess of his immediate requirements for keeping himself alive. And since the more surplus labor, the more surplus value, the drive of capital is to maximize surplus labor, while minimizing, ideally eliminating necessary labor, that is paid labor. So Marx never spoke about women and whatnot, but he's talking about it in the abstract when he's talking about surplus value. And I think that's an entry into Marx to talk about women and all this unpaid labor. So in Marx's words, the best way for capital to realize its, number 13, to realize its sole driving force, the drive to valorize itself, to create surplus value, is to make the means of production absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. And I wonder to what extent this relates to Brenner's point about Uber claiming, oh, they're not laboring, they're consumers. Anyway. So, for this reason, number 14, the great historical bearing or direction, this geschichtliche Seite, so it's very badly translated as historical quality, that's wrong. Bearing or direction is closer. So the great historical bearing or direction of capital is to create this surplus labor. And this historic destiny, Bestimmung, determination is better translation than destiny. So and this historic determination is fulfilled as soon as three conditions are met. First, there has been such a development of needs that surplus labor above and beyond necessity has itself become a general need. So notice here the juxtaposition between need and necessity, with need being historical-culturally determined, it's a discursive construction, and necessity being fixed as the minimum requirement of survival. Okay. So, for example, today's development of culinary and habitational needs goes so far beyond necessity, survival, that surplus labor above and beyond necessity, survival, has itself become a general need. Right. So the second condition for the fulfillment of the historical destiny or determination of surplus labor is achieved, number 15, when the severe discipline of capital over generations, Geschlechter, has developed general industriousness as the general property of the new species, Geschlecht. That is, in my words, when the species has mutated to the level of being so much addicted to labor that it cannot do anything else but laboring. And the third condition is met, number 16, when the development of the productive powers of labor has flourished to the stage where labor in which a human being does what a thing could do has ceased. If everything could be done by things, machines, then whatever human beings do would be surplus labor. In the absolute sense of the word, that is no labor at all, but a pure actualization of potential for its own sake. In Marx's words, number 17, capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labor beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption, and whose labor also therefore appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself. At this point of development, natural necessity, survival, in its direct form has disappeared because a historically created need has taken the place of the natural one. This historically created need is catered by the full development of activity itself,
War corporate clearly asserts the bourgeois political economy and its institutions valorized capital as the premier subject over and above species being. Under such a system, he laments, the individual yields his inner wealth to the outer world. For him, the inner wealth of individuals, their species power, manifests in relationship to the totality of worldly activities that evolve alongside a complex matrix of material relations rather than a single human faculty in relation to a transhistorical essence. Although, as Althusser notes, Marx does not have a scientific understanding of this power, he does have a loose theory that emphasizes embodied engagement in the world as a collective expression of value, one that views bodily senses, as well as other senses, as an index of historically contingent forms of being. For Marx, the forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. This statement and his argument more generally establishes stasis with Adam Smith and other bourgeois political economists around the fact that knowledge derives from sensuous engagement with the world. From this point of agreement, he goes on to critique Smith and others for having left the realm of empiricism by placing agency within other entities, God, the market, or the invisible hand, for instance. Rather than going back to the fictitious primordial conditions, as do those political economists, he claims to proceed from the economic fact of the present. In the present, he argues, capitalism alienates people from their species being by creating man as an individual who works only as a means to life, and in that labor transforms his own powers into the commodity world. To put it differently, the problem with capitalism is that it impedes the natural circulation of being by inhibiting the expression of human activity. The abolition of this process means, for Marx, the possibility of species being that, vis-a-vis alternative materializations, connects humanity with a broader range of its capacities. As the actualization of human passion, the habituating practices of physical and mental labor function as a primary site for this ontological production or subject making. The value-adding power of life, what Marx calls passion, emerges in labor wherein all the natural, spiritual, and social variety of individual activity is manifest. As he describes it, the sensuous outburst of my life is passion, which thus becomes the activity of my being. He goes on to say that passion is the essential force of man energetically bent on its object. This object is not nature that can be contorted into use, but oneself in its diverse powers. It is the life of the species. It is life engendering life. Species being must be enacted through participation in life-engendering activities. Whether called passion, instinct, or nature, it manifests through world-making practices and exhibits itself in individuals as tendencies and abilities. So conceived, being circulates through the constitution of human society, engendering the species along its pathways, and therefore it cannot be reduced to a preordained way of engaging the world that either exists or does not exist. In other words, it's not as though we create communism and then our authentic species being emerges. Perpetually emerging in habitual relationship to worldly practice, the species and its fleshly instincts reflect the world's complex historical unfolding. The human senses, for instance, attune with the political economic relationships of any given moment. As Marx says, not only the five senses, but also the so-called mental senses, the practical senses, will, love, etc. In a world human sense, the human nature of the senses comes to be by virtue of its object, by virtue of its humanized nature. Like Spinoza's Nature in Nature, Marx's Species Being explores humanizing the human. He asserts bodily sensation and its entwinement with conscious understanding as evidence of ontological emergence and its ability to be other than it is. The body's interface with the material world, the senses are both an ontological affirmation of being and a diagnosis of the historicity of that being and its possibilities. Because, from Marx's perspective, our bodily senses discern being as they move and materialize through the relationality of worldly objects, an individual's sensory capacity differs according to different configurations of that world. Capitalism, for instance, materially changes the body in its sensuous experiences. Instead of individuals capable of exerting various human capacities to express a multiplicity of powers, individuals under capitalism narrow their powers according to the needs of commodity relations. In different political economic relations, this is his quote, each of one's human relations to the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, observing, experiencing, wanting, acting, loving, in short, all the organs of one's individual being work equally spontaneously to produce and perceive alternative realities. In short, the bodily and conscious senses of the social man are other senses than those of the non-social man. Given this early theorization of species being as produced within historically contingent practices, it should not be surprising that Marx's labor theory of value reinforces or remains conversant with the sensory experience of worldly action. As the human activity that circulates passion, energy, labor, and as the human activity that circulates passion and energy, labor for him is, and this is a longer quote, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He controls the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head, hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. He develops the potentialities slumbering within nature and subjects the play of its forces to his own sovereign powers. In this passage, as well as throughout Capital, Marx refers to the relationship between humans and nature as a metabolism. It is a living and breathing symbiosis in which the forces within individuals cooperate with the forces of nature to create worldly experiences from myriad potential possibilities. As is well known, in this configuration, a worker sells such labor power, the bodily potential for acting on nature, for creating life, and for creating society, in exchange for his or her wages, or no wages at all. By extracting more labor power from workers than the value of their wages, commodity production has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself. The value difference between daily wages and the daily transfer of labor power results in the surplus value that, as Marx says, lays the golden egg. Much scholarly ink has been used up in deliberations over the mathematical accuracy of such exploitation. And I recognize that that definition of exploitation doesn't include household labor and other slave labor and other things, as the source of wealth and technological advances, but this theory is equally ripe for inquiry into the production of species being. Marx's value theory of labor, though representable in economic terms, is perhaps better understood in an abstraction in the way Althusser defines it, a concrete though invisible reality. Better still might be to conceive value as the materiality of being. Building on the classical political economists, Marx conjectures that life potential moves from workers into the objects of their production. Through its particular configuration of labor, capitalism tracks fluid life energy or species being within the commodity form. In doing so, it transforms ordinary objects into spirited social beings and changes creative, energetic human beings into mechanical and predictable things. In reading Capital with an eye toward the physicality of value, or maybe an effective notion of value, this classic notion of commodity fetishism emerges as a critique of capitalism's material rather than metaphorical production of species potential. Capitalism closes people off, making them less and less receptive to social potentialities. It repels or pushes away identities other than the capitalist and worker, and it depletes life energy of both identities, making them mere caricatures of capital. Such relations rhetorically produce bodily subjects with sensory capacities pegged to capitalism and therefore only operative along a narrow range within wider bandwidth of possibilities. His earlier claim that life potential moves fluidly through individuals and bursts forward in conscious labor practices, both physical and mental, suggests for Marx being in its ideal state circulates through people and their environments. Capitalism interrupts this ideal state by funneling a fluid process into commodity form wherein it becomes ossified. As Marx explains it, the worlding process is extinguished in the product, such that labor becomes bound up in its object. Labor has been objectified, the object has been worked on. What on the side of the worker appeared in the form of unrest now appears on the side of the product in the form of being, a fixed, immobile characteristic. The fluidity of an open and evolving becoming acquires an essentialized being in its commodity form. In the drive to produce and exchange ever more static products, the world becomes merely a global factory. Products multiply exponentially, live their increasingly brief moments of social spectacle, and imprint the world with an environmental waste as a material sign of their time. Human beings whose lifespans have expanded in an inverse proportion to commodities endure in an ever more diminutive fashion. As long as the structure of capital prevails, human beings adopt the characteristics of things. These traits dwell so deeply in our bodies that they appear as natural instincts, even though they are the qualities adapted and adopted through the capitalist mode of production. The worker who must live the life of a commodity by continually selling labor power in order to live, rather than laboring creatively in response to the dynamics of being in the world, turns into a static being. The worker becomes little more than a conduit for value production, on whose bodily capacity constantly undergoes a transformation from the form of unrest into the form of being, from the form of motion into that of objectivity. The entire range of possibilities open to a given life narrows until one is just a worker replaceable by other workers. The owners, though they reap material rewards, are equal victims of capitalism's formative function. Driven by the well-honed sensory reflexes, the capitalist, as long as he or she remains a capitalist, has no choice but to act according to the logic of capital. As Marx says, the immanent laws of capitalist production confront the individual capitalist as a coercive force, or put more directly, his actions are a mere function of capital endowed as capital is in his person with consciousness and a will. Rather than indict a few overzealous owners of production, Marx suggests that a capitalist becomes as much a part of the machinery of capital as does the worker. Transformed in this way, human species capacity dulls. The social soul, the collective labor of the species, goes into every product of labor and in the process limits the life possibilities of its creator. Things take part of our species being, leaving us less well prepared to fulfill our own collective potential. Consequently, the species' power, its sensuous ability to interact with nature and with others, does not function as robustly as it could. The senses of the capitalist being, for instance, cannot detect the living labor trapped within the commodities they engage with on a daily basis. Marx stresses this point, stating that the taste of porridge does not tell us who brewed the oats. Just as consumers are unable to sense the particularities of the labor process, capitalists are unable to discern the process within their profits. Neither seeing nor smelling will tell us that this sum of money is surplus value. Human beings under capitalism simply cannot trust their sensual experience with the world. They cannot see, smell, hear, touch, or taste the value produced within the system because they are bodily decapacitated through the habitual experience as an individualized nodal point within the division of labor. With bodily capacity so diminished, Marx concludes that capitalism must be subject to a scientific investigation, rather than the experiential, bodily, or empirical focus employed in its earlier work. This move that Althusser so applauds ironically displaces critics from the material world into the abstract world of theory. And yet, as I have tried to show, Marx's scientific critique can be read as less a break from his earlier work than a consequence of that work, and specifically its notion of species being as fluid and contingent product of being in the world. Viewing the human being's sensory capacities as evolving in lockstep with production, Marx understands species being and its capacity as lost within capitalism, and so he turns to a different method of discerning and engaging the world. The scientism and not the sensual world of dancing tables and social souls stems much of the political economic work produced in the name of Marxism. On my reading, it is the scientism and not Marx's theory itself that poses a rhetorical problem.
Yeah, so, yeah, we can go ahead and take a full 20 minutes for questions, and then have a short break. Do y'all need help? I do.
I'll start. I really liked how you ended. I thought a really wonderful description of how you can move to the science qualities of like Althusserian through a similar moment that, in a way, that Karina started with was a kind of Spinozist quality, right? Like this idea of what do we do with our own experience with what we can know, right? And at what point do we get to have to use like common notions or collective information, right? To know what's going on, and we're kind of in this lost space. But may I just ask where theoretically there was some post-capitalist subjectivity at one point in this, or like a direction out?
Oh, it wasn't there.
No, it's great. I'm just saying, maybe I just give you a space to say like, well, theoretically we could go into some direction, because I really liked how you made that move to Althusserian. I think if everyone heard that transition, that argument about transitioning to Althusserian, we would probably get rid of a lot of the people who get really uptight about the science language.
Yeah, so Sylvia mentioned earlier about Occupy. Which I thought, oh, you know what, I think there's too much made of the technology and not enough made of the actual face-to-face experience. And that's where I'm going or thinking about when I say using an anti-capitalist subjectivity, that we need to do more embodied work, and it doesn't always just hinge on that aha moment, that consciousness, like, oh, I'm being exploited, I get it, which is very important. But if you're not actually, with other bodies in a kind of community space, sort of experimenting and crafting alternatives, then I think we're missing it.
I gotta tell you, I was ready to kill myself after these presentations, only because I feel really hopeless.
Oh no,
right? It's like, so, but I guess they're like,
there's the hope.
Say, like surfing the net is just the equivalent of, because I was thinking right when I was gonna buy my plane ticket to go actually somewhere else. If I buy a plane ticket, actually I was checking in for here, and on American Airlines they say, yeah, if you buy your ticket with an agent, it costs more than if you buy it online, right? And, and then, if I go to the grocery store or to CVS or wherever and I check myself out, then I'm giving them free labor, right? And I remember one time I went to dinner with friends and we went to this place where you cook your own food. And I thought, well, wow, I don't want to come here. Like, if I'm going to cook my own food, I'm going to stay home and at least know what it is I'm really cooking. And then I thought, well, at least I could just say screw it and like surf the net and look for something to distract me. But I guess apparently I can't.
But it's the realization of Marx's position that in capitalism everything is commodified. Everything. Forget it.
Except face-to-face interaction. Oh, come on.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, so there's we can never get out of the loop, ever. Everything's, we're all just gonna die.
No.
Eventually we will die, yeah.
So when comes the revolution? I mean, I'm speaking now as an activist and not because for me, this is useful only because it informs activism, right? Not you guys useful, but Marx, right? It's like, now you make me want to be an anarchist.
Exactly. No, I agree entirely. That's the real question. Where does activism come in? Precisely, my fear is that we have very wrong assumptions from the past as to what it constitutes activism. That we are entering an era where activism is no longer what used to be activism. Like when I was a youngster, activism, I would take my, I know how to make a Molotov, right? today this is useless.
That's why I love her.
Yes. Well, I come from Greece.
Right.
So this is useless today. What are you going to do with them?
Maybe we should ask coffee.
I'd be like, I have some uses.
So, but there is still a possibility, it's just.
Yes, I agree with you, but the means are not only the same. That's why that was my point about making the job. I'm not sure about the face-to-face, I don't know. I wish, like this relates to your, Kristen, ideal of the house as a revolution, which is my year-old agenda is passionate love as a revolution. It's very close there.
Well, that's face-to-face.
That's I know, I agree. That's my point, and I begin to wonder.
It's in the reproductive
Right,
stage, for
and
sure.
I agree entirely. But I begin to wonder: am I right, or is it
Or
my
is it easy?
or is it my bourgeois?
Exactly. That is a double bond.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that just anarchist free love? I mean, where is that Marxist, I guess I'm saying? I mean, that just sounds a lot to me
Well,
like Goldman.
actually, by passionate love, I don't mean free love. Passionate love is not free love. Passionate love is, I treat you as a unique, unsubstitutable, unexchangeable use value, as opposed to exchange value. Free love is I treat you as exchange value. That's why Lacan was against the 6 years, in Paris. It was like, yeah, you don't understand what you're doing. No, free love is capitalist. Yeah, it treats the other as exchangeable. That comes back to the house. But I don't know, is it our bourgeois desires? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I guess just to follow up on that, in some ways I have the same question for you that you got put initially, because in your presentation it seems like there's this current of vitalism, like you do have a sense of life, some version of life being foreclosed or tamped or what have you. For you, it doesn't seem like there's that, and in fact it's totally ambivalent. So I guess, I think one question is like, how does this lend itself to activism? But my question for you is like, how would we even know where to look? Like what?
And my response is we don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think there are ways to?
Though actually I should, may I? We don't, but I think we can derive some lessons as to what our approach should be. We don't know yet the answer, but and that relates to my question earlier to you, Taylor. Though I agree entirely about your issue, and that relates to your talk, the rhetorical contingency and all that, but I do believe that we don't want to lose sight of structural necessity too, and I think we have to look at the structural potential of capital. What is the structure of capital? Where is it going? So I think that if we're going to look at what is the alternative, how do we find it, we have first of all to figure out what is the actual structure. Without again wanting to reduce everything to a structural determinism.
Perhaps that's in the time part of your article, in the sense that there's different temporalities of objects, and without a kind of strong structural determinism, we can speak of taking hold of objects which exist over the course of different periods of time, and then don't provide a ground which escapes from contingency, but what Deleuze calls the foundation, right? From here we are able to, right? It's a stepping stone that lasts longer or shorter than another possible place to experiment.
Or Sue's point about the strategy, right? The strategy and the structure are deeply connected. You can't talk about one without the other.
Nathan.
Carrying on this. So what if I feel like I want to speak for capitalism, all right, and I want to speak for Uber, or I want to occupy that position for a minute, because so thinking about like the undead, or what would what can we say for a worker in that place, right? And what can we say for a consumer who buys the opportunity to cook, right? And affectively, productively, personally, right? So a worker does not, like, we can look at them and say, poor worker. What do we know about those workers, right? What value do they get out of the work that they do if we only reduce it to one dimension? If they don't care about what they produce, maybe they care about the person they produce next to, or whatever, right? How can we extract meaning out of those practices in creative ways, as creative beings that we are? And also, when we talk about consumer versus worker, you know, those two facets. Of course, capitalism is going to try to extract, you know, profit off all these. But so we go back to the first presentation, and the idea of this product, right? There's products that are supposed to be only valuable because I consume them for my own intrinsic little circle. But then there's like a saxophone. You know, I practice my saxophone. And you might do that for a public or to create a unity with other musicians. And then you're thanking the thing as a vehicle by which you connect with others, right? And you do that all the time. And so there's the, and I was curious, one of my questions was, does she ever say, thank you for allowing me this thing, a vehicle to connect with another person, right? As opposed to you ashtray, or, you know, you vehicle for my collective being. And then producer, right? Do we always have to find value in the things we produce, or can the act or process by which we do anything be valuable for other reasons than the object and my value, right? So I feel like sometimes that in all of this discussion, we're reducing that sort of one-dimensionality, which tends to be a critique of Marx, right? Well, what about the creative capacities to create on my own affect? Do I have, when I consume the Coke, do I have to say Coke is it? Well, no, I don't. I can do it for other reasons, right?
But you probably consume the Coke because Coke is it.
Yes, I know, but not necessarily, right? But that's a facet, but is that the only facet, right?
But both the passages that you quoted and the passages that I quoted from Marx, don't they precisely confirm what you are saying? That the work of the saxophonist, and I'm glad you are bringing the same example I was talking about the musical ear, it does not simply produce, I don't know, some that can sell so many CDs and get so much profit. It produces you as a musical ear. It produces you as the particular human that you are.
And
right?
if you're playing it for your friend, you're producing your friend at the same time in that relationship.
What's it?
Sorry?
What's it? You use the word it. What it?
I said it, the music.
Okay, the music. But you said, but you reduced the actor to who produced the music, right? So is it the musician? Right? So this, who is it that produces me, right? And so there's the distribution system, there's the artist, there's the so where is the aesthetic? Am I determined? Right? So where is the human choice here for my affect, right? Where, and this is exactly your point, right? To the degree that I am determined within limits of capitalism and the things that are exposed to me, distributed, obviously, right? And yet, we choose to, there was always those aspects of, so Uber drivers, we all know when we go on Uber drivers, sometimes these are the most interesting conversations we have at NCA. They're fascinating people.
And
right?
NCA in particular.
And yet they are selling their labor, they are doing these things within the system which we might think unjust, and yet they are fascinating people, very self-aware of what they're doing.
They get rated on their conversation.
But is that the only, let's see, you reduce them.
I did not reduce them.
You've reduced them. Are you being judged only by your participation?
But it's part of the production of the conversation and its importance.
Yeah, but is that the only reason?
But you didn't
No,
recognize
but
it
I
as
was
the reason what you said,
One of these
right?
papers says that.
Of course I do.
But the point, exactly, my point is that on the contrary, what you are saying, you present it as if this were a critique, whereas you are simply reinforcing what the papers were saying.
Well,
That
I don't
it's
think
not
so.
reducible to surplus value, that it produces a mode of life.
Right.
And
Yeah.
of sociability and everything. So we agree. You don't
Well,
say-
yeah, I mean, of course, all these, but what is the, One reactive part to the grim vision that we have in that second paper, right? Well, capitalism doesn't suck everything out of everybody, right? It has these, it's a system with all sorts of terrible things.
And that's what Marx said too. It said human progress, civilization is what capitalism produces. Marx adored capitalism.
Of course, yes.
Okay.
So
for these reasons, he simply didn't like the aspect of exploitation. To the point that Sylvia and others were saying he was too naive. He imagined that capitalism was going to liberate. He imagined that capitalism was going to lead to communism. Whereas what we realize and we realize, you know what, maybe not. That's where we are lost in terms of activism.
But Marion teaches in the Molotov cocktail.
Say that again.
Marion teaches
My next paper will be there.
That's the question. Where is our agency? Which goes back to your question. Where is the agency?
That's an old-fashioned activism.
Oh, well, sure. What, so be old-fashioned.
That's the problem, that we've lost the agency. That's exactly the problem.
And maybe to kind of mediate this, like on the one hand, I think I want to own the grim vision, right? Capitalism sucking everything out means we're just all dead, right? That's
right.
Everything doesn't mean
I
drive Uber instead of a cab, means I'm dead, right? And that seems kind of like an objective reality, and it seems like a reality that's going to be visited on some body at the expense of other bodies. And so I guess I just want to say that like that horizon is fair, and I think you get at that pretty well, right? In terms of thinking about particularly just the environmental horizon, right? And then I think across both of y'all papers, there is room for a sense of collective agency, right? So I'm not sure that agency can be individual.
Yes.
I think the agency is finding these possibilities and making them relationships that are not reducible to this thing that's probably going to kill many of us.
Exactly. So there's a difference, my last point, sorry, I'm breaking point. There's a difference between, that capitalism will ultimately destroy the world, it may be, right, especially environmentally, it's absolutely imperative, right? There is a difference, however, to say that it destroys our soul, right? Because human beings, as a parent, human beings are amazingly resilient, right? And so we can destroy their bodies. That it as a system can destroy their soul, I reject. It can absolutely annihilate people in certain conditions, as can prosperity. But to say that one system can obliterate these people and turn them into, no, I reject that, because I don't think it's my position to be able to say what other people can and cannot do.
Nobody's saying that.
Who said that? Besides, why this dualism? Here is the soul, there is the body. How can the one live and the other die?
Well, okay, so of course the soul, right? Transcendent. The soul meaning the entire lived body and its capacity to act, right?
How can we distinguish?
So that's the question. That was the question of where is that, right? So I'm just pushing back against that. I agree with most everything that's been said here. I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, because I want to, get that tension.
I think that was Josh's point, actually, that precisely we have to start asking your question, which is the question, exactly, what is the agency, for example, in a way that takes into account that precisely we have to approach the question not in a dualist way, in a way where rhetoric and ontology are one, with soul and body are one. And that's what Marx points out through his commodity fetishism theory, that this old, dualism between the two is not going, which is what the Bolsheviks, all of them were still operating that model of here is our soul, there is our body, and that's the problem. Molotovs were good as long as the soul and the body were separate. Today we have to realize they are not, and therefore comes the question, you put it very nicely, collective agency. So I don't know.
So just quickly, Josh, you can go next. I think we can come back together for another round of presentations at 20 after. I want us to be able to keep talking. There's cookie and coffees back there, or cookies and coffee back there. If folks want to take a break, also feel free to step out. But are folks okay if we keep the conversation going and then we convene at 20? Okay. So let's, but continue talking now for at least a little bit.